The gaming industry has to change. This business model will not survive much longer. We're going to get into that and also some other things in this video, but first I want to get into the most recent investors call from Activision about Bungie, more specifically about Bungie's Forsaken sales not being high enough to satisfy their revenue goals for this quarter. In this investors call, Activision Blizzard laid out the revenue and all the recent happenings in Q3 or quarter 3 to their investors, aka people who own stock in Activision Blizzard. And the TLDR version of this is that even though every other title that was mentioned seemingly performed very well, the only one that was mentioned that didn't perform well was Destiny 2 Forsaken, and they cited that the sales were just not there to satisfy their revenue goals. However, when any game performed well, they always happen to cite the in-game monetization of that game. Every time, especially with Call of Duty Blackout. That one was the most heavily harped on that I've seen so far. And while I haven't played the game yet, their phrasing made it seem like they're going to just continue to add more MTX to the game because they feel like players are just going to keep on spending their money. And whenever they mentioned how Forsaken was not performing, they always accompanied it with language and phrasing, which I'll put on the screen here, that made it seem like they wanted to add just more MTX. Now, they did go and mention that Forsaken was a high-quality DLC, but they quickly kind of just glossed over it and went right back into why it's not performing well monetarily. Which brings us to the next part of this discussion, which is why Activision only seems to care about the money and why that is seemingly all that ever matters to them. For those who didn't know, Activision Blizzard is a publicly traded company, meaning that they're being sold on the stock exchange. So they have duties and obligations that other types of companies just don't have. So, for example, if a company was owned by just some people that didn't buy it from a stock exchange, they could do whatever they wanted with the company as long as it was considered legal. However, if it's made public, there's a big difference in how decisions are made and why they're made. In public companies, they have what's called a board of directors. That's where you get terms like chief executive officer, chief operations officer, so on and so forth. This board ultimately makes the decisions that make everything else happen in the company, meaning that they decide the strategy to take the company in a certain direction and what direction that's going to be. However, despite this level of control, their job, or at least their number one priority, is not even to the company itself, but to the shareholders. They're what they call fiduciary duty, which, for those of you who don't understand what that means, it's their legal duty, is to get the shareholders more wealth through the operations of the company. That's their job. So that's why you see such a huge emphasis in the corporations on how much money you made, especially in terms of how much more you made this time period as opposed to last time period, and how much that growth rate is also growing. And of course, the board of directors usually gets a bigger bonus based on how much more money they made for the company, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. However, the way that they're incentivizing it does lead to some less than ideal behaviors. Now, I should mention I'm not currently aware of what or any bonuses that Activision Blizzard executives are getting, if any, but this is a general practice that a lot of corporations at that level do exercise. And this brings me to the issue that I actually wanted to cover, which causes the other problems that we see with Eververse and loot boxes in general, and that is this focus on money first, product second. That is the problem that I'm seeing. The problem here isn't necessarily the corporation itself or even really the officers. It's really with the people who own the company, because once a company goes public, a lot of those who are going to buy that stock or choose not to buy that stock are those who don't really care about the company in the first place. A lot of people who buy in the stock exchanges only care about their money and nothing else. So if their money grows more in your stock versus somebody else's stock, they'll stick around. If that's no longer the case, they'll leave. So because this kind of relationship inevitably breeds short-term behavior, I'm against any game company ever going public. Because what you end up with is year one of D2 Eververse. You end up with the dawning of last year. You end up with Festival of the Cost. Because the focus was so clearly about how do we make more money because our revenue goals have to be met. Instead, the focus needs to be on rebuilding trust with the player base because, like they said in the investors call, a lot of the previous core audience has not re-engaged with this game yet because we are in wait-and-see mode, which is not for no reason. Even though Destiny is, I feel, in the best place it's ever even been, even since D1, I understand those who don't quite trust Bungie just yet, because we've seen them take one step forward and two steps back before. So they're probably waiting for the two steps back to see how bad that is and see if they're willing to tolerate it. Which is why right now their focus should be 100% on rebuilding the brand by putting out rock-solid content like Forsaken consistently. So if they can just kind of hold their breath for a little bit and not pull the trigger on over monetizing the game for at least another year, they're probably going to win over a good chunk of that leftover player base who disengaged from D2.